The sagas tell us that Ivar Ragnarsson, known as Ivar the Boneless, was no ordinary Viking. Born weak in body, unable to walk without aid, he grew into one of the fiercest and most cunning leaders of the great heathen army. His crippled legs did not stop his mind from becoming sharper than any sword. Legends say that his enemies feared him not only for his strategies, but also for the brutal punishments he inflicted. Among these, none carried more terror than the ritual called the Blood Eagle. Its very mention silenced halls, and even hardened warriors shivered when it was whispered by firelight. The Blood Eagle was no simple execution. It was a performance of dominance. The victim was laid down, their arms spread, their chest pressed to the earth. With sharpened blades, their back was sliced open, ribs cracked outward, lungs pulled free so they resembled wings. The victim, still alive, gasped as blood misted the air. But before this horror became legend, it began with vengeance. In the year 865, after the killing of Ragnar Lodbrok in Northumbria by King Ælla, Ivar swore that his father would not remain unavenged. He gathered the mightiest host the Norse had ever seen and crossed the seas to claim blood for blood. The great heathen army marched with a fury that rolled like thunder across the English countryside. Villages burned, monasteries were stripped of gold, and the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the war cries of men who carried the wolf and raven banners. Each step brought Ivar closer to the one he hated most, Ælla. In the camps of the Vikings, tales of the Blood Eagle were retold. Young warriors leaned forward, eyes wide, while older ones nodded solemnly. Some said Odin himself demanded such sacrifices from great kings and traitors. Others claimed it was Ivar's own invention, born of cruelty. Whatever its truth, it was a fate worse than any battlefield death. Night fires burned high as scolds sang of vengeance. They told how the gods smiled when the wings of the eagle were spread, and how the victims' cries reached Valhalla as offerings. The ritual was not just death. It was a mark carved into flesh of dishonor and humiliation. For Ivar, it was justice. He was carried in his chariot, his weak legs wrapped in furs, his piercing eyes glowing like embers. To his warriors, he seemed half man, half god, a spirit of vengeance wrapped in mortal skin. His voice commanded, and thousands obeyed without question. When the Vikings finally cornered Ælla, the trap was set. The English king was dragged, beaten and bloodied into the Viking camp. His crown was gone, his robe torn. He looked more like a thief than a monarch, his dignity stripped by the march of war. Ælla was tied to stakes before Ivar, surrounded by the howling cries of warriors demanding his blood. The king's eyes darted, full of fear, as he looked upon the crippled figure who commanded such terror. He spat curses, but his voice trembled, betraying his dread. Ivar did not shout. He did not rage. His words were quiet, cold, measured like the strike of a blade. "You fed my father to the snakes," he said, "and so you will feed the eagle." The camp erupted in cheers, and Ælla's knees buckled. He had heard the stories. The chosen executioners stepped forward, their knives gleaming in the torchlight. The crowd pushed closer, every warrior eager to witness the moment that sagas would preserve for centuries. The smell of pine tar and iron filled the air, mingled with the stink of sweat and fear. Ælla was stripped bare, his skin pale in the torchlight. He struggled, but ropes bound him tight. His chest heaved with each breath, like an animal cornered. The Vikings chanted, "Blood for Ragnar! Blood for the eagle!" Their voices merged into a storm that swallowed the night. The first cut was long and deep, slicing across the back with a practiced hand. Ælla screamed, his voice cracking, echoing across the camp. His cry was met not with pity, but with cheers, as though each sound of agony was music to the ears of the Norsemen. Ribs were broken outward one by one, each crack louder than the last. The executioners moved with precision, as though crafting something sacred. Ivar watched closely, his face expressionless, only his eyes betraying a flicker of grim satisfaction. Blood poured, steaming in the night air, coating the hands of those who worked. The smell grew thick, metallic, clinging to the breath of every man present, yet none turned away. To witness was to share in vengeance, to take part in the rite of their leader's fury. Ælla's lungs were pulled through the open cage of his ribs, draped outward like wings. His body convulsed, shuddering as he wheezed for air. The wings rose and fell weakly, as though the eagle itself strained to take flight from his broken body. Some warriors shouted in awe, others fell silent, their throats tight with the weight of the moment. This was no ordinary execution. This was theater written in blood and bone, a message carved into flesh. None who betrayed the sons of Ragnar would die cleanly. Ælla's eyes rolled back, his mouth gaping in silent screams as breath failed him. His death was slow, agonizing, drawn out so that every warrior might carry the image home to their villages and halls. The eagle's wings glistened red under the torchlight, a terrible vision of vengeance. When at last his body fell still, silence spread across the camp. Even the fiercest warriors held their breath, as if in the presence of something divine. Ivar raised his hand, and the silence shattered into roars that shook the night. The blood eagle had been carved, the debt of Ragnar repaid. To the Vikings it was more than death, it was justice. To their enemies it was terror itself, a warning that betrayal would be answered with horrors no man could endure. And in that moment, Ivar the Boneless cemented his name not just as a warrior, but as a legend. The blood eagle spread its wings across history, and none who heard the tale would ever forget the image of a king gasping beneath its shadow. The story of King Ælla's end did not remain in the Viking camp. Like fire carried on the wind, the tale spread across the land, whispered in halls, sung in low voices, and etched into memory. The blood eagle was no longer a ritual, it became a symbol. In Northumbria, people spoke of Ælla's last screams as if they still echoed through the valleys. Farmers crossing fields swore they could hear them in the wind. Monks in monasteries painted grim pictures of the eagle, black wings dripping blood hovering over ruined kingdoms. The English lords, who once mocked the crippled Viking as weak, now trembled at his name. For them, death on the battlefield was honorable, but the blood eagle stripped honor away, leaving only shame. To suffer it was to be marked not as a warrior, but as prey. Viking ships returned to Scandinavia carrying not just treasure but stories. In the smoky halls of Norway and Denmark, skalds told how Ivar had avenged Ragnar with fire and steel. They described how the ribs of a king had opened like a cage, and how his lungs had risen like wings. The listeners shuddered but leaned closer, unable to look away. Mothers clutched their children, warning them never to betray kin. Warriors boasted they would face any death, but prayed they would never feel the knives that carved the eagle's wings. Fear gave the ritual its power. For Ivar, the blood eagle was more than vengeance. It was strategy. Terror traveled faster than any army. Entire villages surrendered at the sight of the raven banners, their people offering food and silver without a fight. They had no wish to test whether the eagle's wings might spread again. Chieftains and jarls debated whether the ritual was truly of the gods or a cruel invention. Some claimed it was offered to Odin, a sacrifice ensuring victory in battle. Others muttered that it was Ivar's own cruelty, born from a twisted body that sought dominion through fear. But none denied its effect. The mere threat of it was enough to break men. Captured leaders often begged for the sword or the noose, anything but the eagle. In this way, Ivar bent both Christian and pagan lords to his will, without raising his own crippled hands. The chronicles written by monks condemned the ritual as blasphemy. They wrote of it with horror, describing it as the work of demons. Yet by recording it, they preserved the terror, and their words carried it through the centuries. Ironically, their fear gave Ivar immortality. Still, not all Norsemen agreed with his ways. Some jarls grumbled that the eagle brought dishonor, that it was not fitting for a warrior's end. They argued that Odin desired bravery, not cruelty. But these voices were drowned in the roar of Ivar's victories. On long marches, warriors boasted of having witnessed the eagle. They described it with both awe and revulsion, their voices dropping as though speaking of something forbidden. It was a story that bonded them, proof they had stood at the side of a kingmaker who could bend life and death. Ivar himself seldom spoke of Ælla's fate. He let the story grow on its own, like a fire needing no stoking. Silence gave it power, for no denial meant no escape. The fear remained, blooming in the minds of those who dared cross him. The ritual also served another purpose. It set Ivar apart from his brothers, who led the great heathen army with him. While Ubbi, Halfdan, and Sigurd were fierce warriors, it was Ivar's cruelty that carved his place in legend. He was not just a son of Ragnar, he was a terror of his own making. In conquered towns, the blood eagle became a threat whispered by Viking captains. "Obey," they said, "or feel the eagle's wings." For common folk, the words alone broke courage. The ritual need not be performed often. Its shadow was enough to command obedience. Christian priests began to describe Ivar as a servant of Satan, a cripple possessed by demons. Yet the more they demonized him, the more his legend spread. Even peasants who never saw a Viking ship feared the eagle, imagining it hovering in their darkest dreams. To the Norse, however, the story gained another layer. Skalds claimed the eagle was not merely execution but transformation. By opening the back and freeing the lungs, the soul was released like a bird, flying to the gods. For enemies, this was mockery. For some believers, it was twisted sacrifice. The ritual's cruelty created division, but it also gave Ivar what he craved: control. His weak legs had once left him powerless, mocked as useless. Now kings and warriors alike feared his will. His body may have failed him, but his legend made him unstoppable. And as the great heathen army swept across the kingdoms of England, the question followed them like a shadow. Would the blood eagle rise again? Was every captured lord destined to feel the knives, to breathe his last breath beneath crimson wings? Ivar never answered. His silence was louder than any threat. He allowed the eagle to live in the imagination of his enemies, an unseen predator circling above them. In their fear, they surrendered, paid tribute, and bent the knee. Terror was a weapon sharper than steel. The image of Ælla's lungs stretched wide, haunted dreams. Children grew up hearing the tale, their minds painting it in fire and blood. Some believed it, others doubted, but none forgot it. The blood eagle became part of the Viking tapestry, woven into both fear and myth. And so the ritual spread far beyond its single moment, carried in words, stories, and the silence of Ivar himself. It was no longer just the death of a king. It was the birth of terror as a tool of rule, a shadow that reached across seas and centuries. Centuries passed, and yet the shadow of the blood eagle did not fade. From the smoky halls of Scandinavia to the monasteries of England, the story lived on, passed down in whispers and ink. What began as vengeance for Ragnar became one of the most infamous images of Viking cruelty. But with time came questions. Did the ritual truly happen as described, or had fear twisted memory into nightmare? Some sagas spoke clearly of ribs cut and lungs spread, while others hinted at it more vaguely, leaving space for imagination to fill the gaps. Monks, eager to paint the Vikings as demons from the north, wrote of the ritual in vivid detail. To them, the image of a man's back split open and wings of flesh rising in agony was proof of heathen savagery. Their writings colored how later generations saw Ivar and his kin. Yet the Norse sagas themselves were less consistent. Some described the blood eagle as real, performed on kings like Ælla and Halfdan of Northumbria. Others treated it as a poetic metaphor, an eagle carved not into flesh, but into memory, a symbol of vengeance rather than an act of the knife. Historians debated its truth. Was it possible to carve open ribs without killing the victim instantly? Could lungs truly resemble wings, rising and falling with final breaths? To some, the ritual was anatomy stretched into myth, a horror exaggerated to frighten foes. Still, others insisted that men of the Viking Age were capable of such cruelty. After all, executions then were not merciful affairs. Impalement, flaying, and burning were known across cultures. Why should the Norse not have their own grim theatre of death? The blood eagle thus lived in a space between fact and legend. It was both history and horror story, a ritual performed by hands or by words. What mattered was not whether it happened exactly as described, but that people believed it could. Belief gave it life, and in that belief, Ivar the Boneless endured. His weak body was forgotten. His crippled legs became only a detail in the tale. What remained was the image of a man so fearsome that kings trembled, a leader who carved his vengeance into the flesh of a rival. The ritual's echo even shaped later generations of rulers. To threaten an enemy with the blood eagle was to wield centuries of terror in a single word. Warriors who never set eyes on Ivar still invoked his name as if his spirit lingered in the shadows. For common folk, the story became a warning. Parents frightened children into obedience by whispering of the eagle's wings. Fishermen crossing stormy seas muttered prayers not to fall into the hands of men who carried its memory. The eagle soared above daily life, unseen but ever present. Archaeologists found no bones to prove the ritual's reality, no skeleton scarred by such carving. Yet, in the absence of proof, the tale grew larger. Stories often survive not because they are true, but because they are powerful. The blood eagle was both. Even among modern scholars, debate raged. Some argued the ritual was mistranslated, the words of old sagas twisted by later scribes. Perhaps carving the eagle meant nothing more than slashing the back in a pattern, leaving scars shaped like wings. Others clung to the brutal version, insisting truth lay in horror. But whether symbol or flesh, the blood eagle did its work. It made Ivar unforgettable. It made the Vikings more than raiders. It turned them into figures of terror in the Christian imagination. A single story spread their shadow wider than any fleet of ships could sail. In art, the eagle spread its wings. Medieval manuscripts painted it with dark ink, while later poets used it as a symbol of merciless revenge. The ritual entered not just history, but literature, legend, and myth, carried forward long after the men who first told it turned to dust. The power of the blood eagle was not in how many times it was done, but in how it lingered. One ritual, perhaps true, perhaps not, shaped centuries of fear. That is the weight of stories. They survive where bones crumble, and they rule hearts where armies cannot. Ivar's name became bound forever to the eagle. To speak of him was to recall the wings of blood. He was no longer simply a Viking leader. He became a figure larger than life, half man, half nightmare, soaring above the battlefield in a haze of legend. And so the blood eagle remained, etched in sagas, carved into the words of monks, and whispered across generations. It mattered little whether it had been real. What mattered was that people believed, and in their belief, terror lived on. In the end, the ritual was both execution and myth, both cruelty and symbol. It was a story that asked not whether the wings were ever carved, but what fear can do when given form. The blood eagle was never just about death. It was about control, memory, and the shaping of power. And through it all, Ivar the Boneless, weak in flesh but mighty in legend, became eternal. His crippled frame was forgotten, but his terror took flight. The eagle's wings, red and terrible, still beat across time, reminding us that sometimes the most enduring truth is the fear left behind.